I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Contemplating Culture.
Hello, everyone.
And so today we move into our second episode in the chapter of the malaises of modernity. And I think last episode we talked about what that word malaise means. It's kind of that feeling like something's missing, but you're not really sure what it is, but it's a common feeling of something's flat or lacking meaning. It's not quite right. And today we're stepping further into what some of the things that are happening under the surface that are creating that malaise. And in a particular way, part of that is the work of the Nova effect, that once one alternate position becomes possible, there's many, and that creates kind of emotional chaos for society.
Yeah, I've been thinking, I've thought of my own synonym for malaise. I think the word I want to use is uneasiness. That we live in a world where there's this uneasiness. Do I have the answers or not? Is my way of living the right one or not? There's this discomfort.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And so where we start today, Taylor is talking about the modern package. He says the modern package is communally held as the way things are. We've got the buffed identity, which we've talked about before. We've got disengaged subjectivity. I'm a disengaged subject that can be my own maker of meaning. I've got all the disciplines around that are supporting this, and together we're sustaining an order of freedom and mutual benefit. So he's saying these are kind of the key elements. This package feels threatened by Orthodox Christianity. And so it's going to have a reaction to, and it might just be one of those elements of the package of feeling threatened. And so he's saying the Nova effect takes off in this period of time because even one part of that package gets threatened, and then there's 15 different ways that people respond to that. And another part of it gets threatened, and there's another 20 responses. And some of them will be returning back to faith, and some of them will be new ways of unbelief. And so he outlines 4 reasons that the package of the modern moral order is being threatened, or objections that it has to Orthodox Christianity. So the first one he says is that it offends reason. So there's not really space in the modern package for mystery. We're meant to understand or be able to understand everything. Christianity kind of has this place of paradox, which we talk often. And he's saying, well, like that doesn't really hold because it's meant to make logical sense, right? So this thing around reason. The next one he talks about, number 2, is Orthodox Christianity has this authoritarian element that is offensive to both freedom and reason. You can't tell me that there's someone higher than me, that there's something outside of me that gets to decide meaning or things like that. And so it's this sense that, that doesn't really work. And there's going to be a whole bunch of responses to that objection. Now, the third one he talks about is that Orthodox Christianity poses the impossible problems of God in response to suffering, which we've talked about before, theodicy, trying to give an account of God in the midst of this suffering. And he says, well, a lot of those outcomes will either try to diminish how bad the suffering really is, or they'll put an answer outside of this lifetime, outside of this imminent frame that the modern moral order is really sitting around. And that's going to be problematic because it needs to make sense in the here and now. I can't wait for some future life that hopefully it'll make sense then. The fourth point he has here is that it threatens the orders of mutual benefit. And this is through the ways, I guess, of mortifying the self, others, things that are imposed, legitimate authority, all of that kind of stuff. And so what we wanted to pick up today is to follow the same line of Taylor here, where he looks at these 4 points and he says, well, 1, 2, and 4, we can make sense of in an imminent mindset, but there's something problematic about theodicy because it can't be made sense of in the imminent frame.
So basically, restating that, problem with Christianity is it offends against reason, it offends against freedom, it offends against the immanent frame, and it offends against the order of mutual benefit, as in, like, it sets up a whole different way of seeing the world that does not fit with the modern moral order. And theodicy is the most problematic of this. And it's interesting because, like, theodicy is perhaps its own category because it doesn't, like I just said, oh, it offends against the immanent frame. It also offends against reason. It's really hard to argue, and especially if you're sitting within the immanent frame. And it offends against freedom because, like, I don't get to choose how God sets up the world, and it doesn't fit. I can't make sense of it in that way either. And there's no sense of the modern moral order of mutual benefit at play either in this world and the suffering we experience. Like, actually, it just doesn't fit with any aspect of the modern moral order, the idea of human suffering. It's a mystery that even the modern moral order has to come to terms with in some way.
I don't know about you, but I find it's one of the questions that young people or people standing in a questioning state or an unbelieving state have of Orthodox Christianity is this question of suffering and how can a good God allow this to happen? And I remember being in a school setting last year and one of the young people asked me, this question. And I think I did an okay job, but I think the thing that I was really struggling with was this is a year 10 student who probably doesn't have a great deal of theological formation. And how do you package something so big for someone who, as much as they think they know everything and think everything needs to fit in the framework that they know, like how can you I was really struggling with how to put the package into their worldview, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, because I think the answers to the question actually require you to step out of that worldview. It needs you to step out of the immanent frame. It needs you to step out of the assumption that you can use reason to explain everything.
And in my reflection of this, like I said, I was kind of unhappy with how I'd responded to it, but on account of the situation of, yeah, it's quite challenging to put something that doesn't fit in a box into a box. And I was thinking, like, one of the things that you need to really engage with theodicy from an Orthodox Christianity perspective is to appreciate that the box is open and that there can be answers outside the box. And what kind of came into my mind was I remember being in year 12 and I was doing like extension 1 maths, and there was only one person doing extension 2 maths, and I was like, "Oh, what kind of stuff do you do there?" And she said, "We're doing a topic on imaginary numbers." And I'd never heard of imaginary numbers before. And I was like, what is it? And she's like, well, it's where you take the square root of -1. I'm like, no, no, you don't have a square root of a negative number, because my level of mathematics had only taken me to that point. And in the mathematics that I understood, there's no way that you can square root a negative number. It doesn't make sense within my framework. So it kind of sat there of like this weird thing that advanced mathematics deals with. Don't really know why they're doing it. Then I landed in uni and I did mechatronic engineering as one of my degrees. And in part of that, we look at electrical currents, and bing, bing, imaginary numbers pop up. And not only are they there and do we need to work out how they work, but we actually had to use them. So you use imaginary numbers to measure alternating electrical currents. And it's like this thing that doesn't make sense in my realm of logic is usable. Like it's so far beyond me, like it doesn't make sense, and yet we're using it as though it's something real. And it's like for me, it's like I had to be able to do this calculation, you have to put trust in this thing that I don't understand. And I think that theodicy can fall into the same category of if I'm only operating as though I already have all of the rules, then I'm not open to a possibility that there's something going to come into play that I don't yet understand. And so for
Mm,
me, it's a really good example of if you stay with a closed mind on what's possible, you can't get to God.
it's very true. Such a good example. I think the other thing that really struck me, and we might get into some of the stances that Taylor talks about with regard to theodicy, but the thing that really struck me was where he talks about that it's not so much logical argument as people's emotional experience that is driving their reactions in the area of theodicy. Like there is a rational need to understand, but actually where suffering is concerned, like it hits this nerve in us that is, it's more than just my need to understand and explain, but like I hurt, people I love hurt, and I'm responding, and we'll see this in a sec, I'm responding out of that space of my emotional experience.
It's been a little while since we've done a solid chunk of a quote from Taylor, but I think this one's worth it because I think he captures perfectly the experience that we're trying to articulate here of how do you respond, and how you respond might vary depending on where you're coming from. So this is from page 306. He says, someone close to you dies. You may want to hang on to the love of God, to the faith that they and you are still with God, that love will conquer death, even though you don't understand how. What do you say to the challenge of theodicy? One answer could be that in a sense, God is powerless. That is, he cannot just undo this process without abolishing our condition, and hence our coming to him from out or through of this bodily condition. Although occasionally the spark of our coming to him lights up and there can be surprising cures. Or on the other hand, it can be too painful, maddening, full of self-torture to feel that God could have helped but didn't, or that God somehow couldn't help but is supposed to be all-loving Father. There is a fight to go on remaining in the love of God. It's a relief to flip over and give vent to anger. You can say, I don't want to pardon God. But in another way, you can say, I see it all as blind nature, and I can let myself go to hate this or consider it my enemy. I no longer have the burden of having to see it as benign. I can just let fly, take it as my implacable adversary, and there is relief in this. And so what he opens up here is that, this loved one dies, and we can choose to be in the love of God and be sitting in that stance of this person's still in love with God, I'm still in the love of God. Or we can let go, let all the anger out and move to this position of revolt or rebellion. And so he puts these two stances as the relief of refuge or the relief of revolt.
And I think there's something really significant in the use of the word relief, I think, coming back to that sense that in our current contemporary world, it's not just rationality that rules. It's actually that expressive individualism, that emotional response to the world around us, that like I think maybe I'm responding rationally, but I'm actually responding emotionally. I'm unhappy. I'm in pain. I need to express that pain. I need to find reasons for that pain. I need to find reasons for the way that I've chosen or I choose to express that pain. So the relief of refuge, the relief of taking refuge in the love of God, the relief of revolting against the concept of a God who is powerless or who doesn't love me enough to fix my situation or whatever it is. The word relief, I think, is quite powerful. I guess I've been sitting with it too, because this whole section of the book is called the Nova Effect. And we just talked about the possibility of so many different responses to what we find going on in the world. And I just think theodicy is a good example of this, that it's not like there's just two responses to theodicy, revolt or refuge. Like there are a myriad of them and we find them. I started trying to list and name some of them and I was trying to find our names just to fit with his thing. And I'm thinking, well, there's ridicule. There's the person who's pain and frustration finds relief in ridiculing somebody else's belief in God. And it's not even a revolt against God so much as a ridicule of the idea of God or of the person who would still believe in a God in the face of such suffering. There's the roller coaster response, the riding the wave of the suffering and the I don't know what's going on. I think this really sits around mutual fragilization and this sense of that your beliefs, which are different to mine, sow the seeds of doubt in me. And so maybe this is a good way of describing the seeker's position of riding this roller coaster of, really finding a safe place, a haven in refuge in the love of God, and then being rocked by some kind of suffering and plunged into a space of despair and finding relief in a space of revolt or rebellion against such a God. But then, the roller coaster comes around and I maybe have some kind of encounter with that God that leads me back into a place of safety and refuge and ability to trust. So there are people who ride a roller coaster around theodicy, and I'd say there are more people like that than perhaps any of these other categories that I come across. It's quite a regular one within circles of faith. Then I would say there's riddle, the relief of riddle, that like almost seeing theodicy as a riddle that I've got to solve, applying my rational brain to like what is the answer or what are the right answers. And I'm interestingly sitting with, the answers that people come up with and the comment of Charles Taylor's that the relief of revolt is not so much about logical argument as much as existential attitude. I was sitting with it and I realized that a lot of these arguments around theodicy that go with revolt come from within an immanent frame. They come from within that mindset of the door closes at the end of life. And we did a podcast back on this right back in number 3, I think it was, number 2. Our second podcast was all about fullness of life and what we regard as a full life, and talking about the difference between those who see life as ending with a closed door when we die and those who see our death as an open door leading into eternal life, whose life is open to the transcendent. And I realized that if you stand back and look from the transcendent, a bit like you said about that year 10 girl, you have a whole different range of arguments, or not even arguments, but a whole different perspective on how you might look at and approach suffering and God in this world. But, whether you're looking from a transcendent or an immanent point of view, there would be some people and a stance that you could take around theodicy as a riddle that I have to solve. And even distancing myself from the emotional experience by escaping into my head and purely applying a rational approach to it all.
And to be honest, like at one point in my life, I definitely thought that was the job of a Christian, was to engage with the riddle, that we had to find the perfect answer in apologetics.
Mm.
But I love this cat of, I think you're right. There's many, many ways that and that's his whole point, right? In the Nova effect, there's lots of ways. So I'd like to throw in another R word, if that's all right. I reckon there's a category of people that look at all of this and like, man, that is so much hard work. I'm just going to retreat. I'm just going to focus on, like going to work, getting money, having a meal, going out with my friends. Like the overall, what's this all about? How does this all make sense? There's, I reckon, a category of people that their response is to just retreat.
Yeah. It's like is it MIDI? The MIDI approach to life, where it's just about me and my family and our immediate needs, and I'll just focus on that and not try to solve the problems of the world. So then I'm coming back to Taylor's relief of refuge. And I'm just sitting with it. And I have to say I struggled with it a little bit because the idea of refuge felt a bit like retreat for me. I was reminded of Karl Marx and, religion's the opiate of the masses. And I was like, well, there's more than that. And if you read what Charles Taylor has to say, He's not at all suggesting that meaning for refuge. But I had this experience yesterday, actually, where I was teaching on the sacrament of anointing of the sick with a bunch of catechists. And I got to the end and I was feeling all insecure, as you do when you're teaching on a sacrament about healing and trying to talk about, coming with expectant faith for the healing of God. When I'm full knowledge, one of the questions I got asked was, well, what's the statistic of how many people would get physically healed after receiving the sacrament of anointing of the sick? And I was like, I have no idea, but I suspect it's probably quite small. Didn't say that out loud, but we were then talking about the mystery of redemptive suffering and the mystery of suffering generally. And they started sharing about their own approach. And I was really profoundly touched. And I knew this podcast was coming up, and I knew we'd probably end up touching on theodicy. And I thought, here is a bunch of people who fit into maybe the category of people Taylor is talking about when he's talking about the relief of refuge. But I don't think it's just a relief. I think here are people who have been profoundly touched by suffering, but have a profound relationship with God and have had to engage in, well, how do I make sense of these two things? And what I heard as I listened to them was the open door perspective, the fact that they can see that the world is bigger than the closed door at the end of life, that we have more to hold on to, but also are looking beyond their own experience. Like one of them said in a really beautiful way, the temptation in the experience of suffering is why me? And I've learned to say, well, why not me? Why somebody else rather than me? And just this profound capacity to engage that can only come from having a perspective that is bigger than this immanent frame that the modern world limits our world to. And I was thinking, if I was going to find a different R word to refuge, I think it would be relationship, which I probably come back to you every podcast, because I think the grounding here is a really solid grounding in the relationship with God and an ability to sit with the paradox of a good God and a suffering world, and an ability to stand back from the immediacy of what they're experiencing or what they're seeing and see from a transcendent perspective that there's probably a whole lot that they can't see, those imaginary numbers, and put their trust in that.
It's very beautiful, that question of why not me? And you can't do that from so many of these standpoints. You really need to have something firm that you're holding on to be able to engage with that, I think.
And I guess it comes back to one of those arguments against Christianity that's not theodicy, the threatening of the order of mutual benefit, like the existence in Christianity of that capacity to sit with the idea of asceticism or a particular discipline in my life or that sort of thing that counts as a mortification, or to endure persecution for my faith, doesn't make sense in this world of mutual benefit. What do I get out of that? Or nothing in this world, perhaps.
And so we're in the chapter of the malaises of modernity. And I guess Taylor's point after bringing through all of this is that being in the midst of all of this, all of the different positions that might emerge, leaves us in the malaise where we feel like some sense of clarity is lost, some sense of overarching unity. We're not quite sure how we would name what it is, but we feel like something's been lost. Then we look at what we do have and it feels flat, like it's lacking weight. And not only that, but it feels fragile. It feels like I could be here today, but like that roller coaster you were talking about, but then I could be over on that mountain tomorrow and in that valley the day after. Like where I am feels fragile. And yeah, I think it's just really good to be able to give a word to a common experience. I think even that in itself is helpful.
It's interesting. The only quote when I was writing my notes in preparation for this podcast on this part of the chapter, the only direct quote I wrote from Charles Taylor was this one. He said, "Everyone understands this kind of issue." And a little bit later on in the same paragraph, he says, this was not true of earlier epochs. So there's something about this age in which we live where the malaise of immanence, like we don't actually have to work too hard to explain this to you because we know that you understand it. It's the air we breathe, it's what we live in, but it's not the way things have been for all time. And we've talked about, where we've come from and the earlier ages where this sense of like life had a meaning and a purpose and a direction, and it was commonly understood. We've moved so far from that in this era that the multiplicity of offerings we would call a nova effect, a supernova of possibilities. But there's not that sense of a clarity and a one thing that gives life a meaning and direction and purpose.
And I guess maybe the closest society in the West ever got to that was Christendom, where everything was, like public society, personal life, they were all had this unity of purpose. And so one of the things that is like, well, now without that unity, there's a lot of different ways that people can go. And Taylor says that one of the responses that people have is to want to find a new one thing. And he gives the example of Rousseau. I'm not that familiar, but he says he makes the project the natural, finding deeper purpose, joy in the natural. And you could look at prominent figures through history since then and look at people that have a project of, just got to, like this is the one thing, this is the one necessary thing. And as I was reading that, I was thinking about one of our sisters when she gives her testimony of conversion. She talks about a priest that they were having a conversation with, and he said, if God is anywhere other than your number one priority in life, everything else won't make sense. Like if you have God as number one, everything else can kind of fall into place. And I feel like there's so many people of faith today that are stuck in that dilemma because we're trying to fit God into the modern package because we've accepted that. Whereas if you accept God, then you can pick and choose what else fits into that.
Isn't it so topsy-turvy? Here we are in the modern age, like we try to fit God into a package where it's like picking and choosing God as one of the options that I fit into my package. But actually the way around it's supposed to be is pick God and then pick and choose what of the modern package fits in with that.
And that's what it made me think of. Like, oh, I don't need another one thing. I've already got my one thing. And maybe that's a reflection for all of us today to look at that, especially if you're a person of faith, of like, how is my life ordered? Where do I put the priorities? What's the place of God? Because if he's not one, everything else is going to be very confusing.
Mm. And not just one, but like the ordering principle as number one. It makes me think of, and maybe we could even finish on this, makes me think of that passage in Deuteronomy, which is so core, not just to Christianity, but also to the Jewish faith, from Deuteronomy 6:4-7. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. There's my one thing.
Oh man, so good. Well, thank you for listening, everyone, today, and thanks, Kat, for a really enjoyable conversation looking at this, and look forward to next time.
Thank you. Amen.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.